Good afternoon to everyone from Asia and good morning to those from Europe. My name is Fiona. I am the marketing for Eurofins AQM. I'm your MC today and very happy to see you all here virtually. I hope you are not too bored at home or under the confinement. So today, my colleague Francesca is going to deliver a webinar on getting started with environmental audits. Environmental audit and environmental compliance have become a very hot topic for most of the industry, particularly for textile, garment, and footwear production. So without further ado, I will let Francesca begin her presentation. Over to you, please, Francesca.
Thank you, Fiona, for this introduction. So welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be connected today with to be introducing the topic of environmental audit. So my name is Francesca Giometti and I'm a senior environmental advisor and a training manager for Eurofins AQM. So I used to be based in Bangladesh for more than 4 years. And when I was in Bangladesh, I was in charge of environmental audits. And I had the chance to visit and audit factories in Bangladesh, in China, in Cambodia, in Turkey, and in Morocco. So what I definitely want to do today with you is to share my experience visiting those factories. I definitely want to talk about very practical situation and yes, to give you an insight about what is going on in these factories. So how is the webinar organized? This webinar will be starting with a presentation of about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for question and answer. So during this presentation, you will see sometimes there will be a pool, a window with some questions. So we just want to make this webinar to be a bit more interactive, and it is also a way for us to know a little bit more about you. Why this webinar? What is your current knowledge about the topic? Don't worry, it is anonymous, so we don't see who is answering what. You just vote and then we show the general results. At the end of this presentation, I'm going, of course, to sum up the key takeaway of the webinar, and this webinar is recorded. So at the end, if you want, you can watch again the webinar. We will send the link. You will also get the presentation file. Okay. So what is the agenda? First of all, we are going to discuss about the scope of the environmental audit. And also we are going to discuss why should we perform environmental audits in the factories? What are the reasons why this type of audit is quite important? The second chapter is about introducing the initiatives and standards related to the environmental assessment of factories. So I won't have time to go in detail for each initiative and standard, but I'm going to give an introduction. And if you are very interested in this topic, you can register to the last webinar in April, which is specifically about initiatives and standards. So today you have an introduction, and if you want to go in details, you can refer to the dedicated webinar about initiatives and standards. And the last chapter today will be about environmental challenges in key production countries. As I told you, I had the chance to travel to many production countries, and we did environmental audits in these different countries. So we want to share with you some findings regarding how environmental issues are addressed in these countries. Okay, so let's start with the first pool. So Fiona will help me with this. So you can see a window popping up. You have 3 questions. So first question is about why did you decide to attend this webinar? Then we want to know, how do you rate your current knowledge about environmental audit and assessment approaches? Last question is about, according to you, what is the most critical environmental topic for the industry? So take your time, but it's going to be very quick. And remember, this is anonymous. And we are going to share the results in a moment. So I think now we are good. Everyone has voted. We encourage the participation. Huh?
Yeah, I think people are still voting, so I can see the voting going up very fast. So maybe we can give them another 10 or 15 seconds.
Okay. Okay, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, maybe we can stop the polling. For
Yeah.
everyone who want to vote, be faster next time.
Yeah. Okay, let's see the results.
Yeah, give it a second.
Yeah, okay. So very interesting to see the results, because what drive you to this webinar? We can see that a majority of respondents indicated that they are actively working on this, and so they need all possible information. So this is great, because it means that this topic of environmental awareness and environmental assessment in the supply chain is an important board agenda. How would you rate your current knowledge about environmental audit, assessment approaches and initiatives? So a majority of attendees are indicating that they consider that they are beginners, that they need indeed to learn a lot, because currently they have a very low and very they just know a little bit, but they need definitely to learn more about the topic. Okay, and sorry, so about the last question, from your perspective, which environmental topic is the most critical one for the textile and leather factories? Very interesting to see that we have wastewater treatment and hazardous substances control in the production that are the two topics with the more votes. Indeed, wastewater and hazardous substances are hot topics. I'm going to mention, of course, these topics today, but again, to go more in details, we will have a dedicated webinar about the main challenges, the three main challenges for textile and leather factories, and two of these three main challenges are indeed the wastewater treatment, how to get rid of hazardous substances in the production, and how to deal with hazardous waste. So definitely, if you want to learn more, you will have as well more details about these topics in the next webinar. Okay, let's start with the scope of the environmental audit. So first of all, which part of the supply chain is concerned? When you want to address environmental topics, you can have different issues. You can want to focus on cotton, organic cotton. In this case, you're looking at the raw material stage of the supply chain. If you're looking at our footprint, you might have to focus on different stage of the supply chain, for example, the transportation and logistic. When you want to focus on assessing the environmental performance of the production, you are targeting the factories from to finished garment production. So here I have an example of supply chain for the textile industry, but in the same way for other industries, the environmental audit is targeting the factories where you are assembling your product. But not only where you are actually assembling the product. You have to think, what are the process in my industry, what are the process where there might be an environmental risk. You have to think about water, chemicals, energy. So in the textile industry, it is well known that the factories targeted for environmental audits are the wet processes. So we are talking about textile dyeing, we are talking about printing, the denim process are very, very much polluting. But also, of course, the later, so the tanneries are factories to target for environmental audits, as well accessorize, actually. Outside of the textile industry, you have other, of course, production process involving the use of water, of chemicals and energy. I'm giving some examples here. If you are a retailer, for example, if you're selling electronic products or if you're selling household products, you might as well want to identify the production process with chemicals. Every type of process about polishing some metallic product, painting, for example, coloring these products. These are factories where you have chemicals, as you can see in these pictures. The problem is, when you want to environmental audits and when you want to follow a wet process, it might not be your tier 1 supplier. So in this slide, you can see different scenarios of how the suppliers are organized for different production process. So most of the time you are in contact with your tier 1 supplier, but this tier 1 supplier can be only doing the garment assembling part. Whereas what you are interested in is to identify the production site with a wet process. And you can see that in this first scenario, the factory you are targeting is not your tier 1 supplier, but it's your tier 2 supplier, the fabric dyeing. So in this case, of course, the first step before starting environmental audits is to make a mapping of your supply chain. You need to understand, okay, this is my tier 1 suppliers, what are the production process operated from these suppliers, and if they don't have the wet process, I need to identify which factory is in charge of this wet process part of the production. In other cases, you might see that your tier 1 supplier is indeed having the wet process step. This is a good news. And indeed, I will suggest you, if you start environmental audits, to start identifying your tier 1 with integrated wet process step, because it will be easier for you to conduct an environmental audit in your tier 1 suppliers, of course. So this is an important step. You need to do a mapping before you can start your environmental audit. Also, we must be honest, it's not so easy to identify all the tier 2 suppliers. So again, you need to start with your most important suppliers. You need to decide to focus maybe on a specific product. For example, if you are selling denim products, you should start with denim because you know this is a product with major environmental issues, and maybe it will be easier for you to work with your denim suppliers. Why performing environmental audits? Why? We can think, okay, in a country, there are some laws and regulations. So we can imagine that the factories must comply with environmental laws and regulation. Unfortunately, we know it's not like this. So even when a country have some local environmental laws, it's not always, you don't have any guarantee that the factory is compliant with this law. You're not sure that there is an enforcement of the laws. So conducting an environmental audit is a way that the factory is, first of all, aware of environmental laws, and second, that the factory is compliant and enforcing the application of these laws. Because I'm going to discuss this in the slides about the production countries, but in many of these production countries in Asia, there is a lack of local authorities controls. So environmental audits, that the environmental laws are enforced on site. And environmental audits are actually going beyond the legal requirements. Why? This is a difference with social audit. For social audit, you mostly focus on laws and regulation, the local ones and the international standard. In the case of environment, we don't have the same legal framework. And in many countries, the laws are very weak. So it is very important to have strict environmental requirements list to ask the factory to comply with. So I will give you the examples when I describe the chapters of the environmental audits. Let's go to the next reason why environmental audits should be done. Factories are mostly used to social audits, but still a large part of the factories are not used to environmental audits. They are not aware of the environmental issues. So conducting an environmental audit is also a way to raise awareness among the suppliers about this new topic and to boost their knowledge about environmental topics. In particular, around the workplace safety and health. Sure, we are talking about environment, but remember that the workers are the first to be affected by the pollution, by the problems in the factory related to chemicals, to wastewater, to waste. So we have definitely with the environmental audits to make the factory understand that through this environmental awareness, we are trying to go more in details in how to protect the workers. We want to do more for the workers. We need to think about the environment for them, and we need to be even more, to pay more attention to substances, for example, affecting the workers. Of course, conducting environmental audits, it's also a way to protect the brand's images from risk arising from environmental non-compliances and issues. And let me show you some pictures. Okay, the buyers are sometimes visiting the factories, but we know they have a very limited time. They're traveling, they have just 1 hour to spend in the factory, so they don't have time to visit the whole factory. So they arrive on site and there is a factory manager telling them, okay, come with me, I'm going to show you the factory, and then we are going in the meeting room and discuss business. So if you are this buyer, you arrive in the factory and you see, oh, okay, looks nice. So this is what you see in the front. This is the front side of the factory. What you don't see is the back side of the same factory, which doesn't look so nice. When you are conducting an environmental audit, you are making sure that there is no part of the factory which is hidden. So it means that the environmental auditor is going to spend a lot of time visiting the factories, not only the front side, not only the production section, but around the factory. The environmental auditor will go inside of the factory and he will notice what is the current situation regarding environmental compliance. Because when you are in the front side of the factory management can be explaining that there is a project to plant some trees. So, okay, that's maybe good, But when you go in the backside and you see that there are some problems with the wastewater, because this is an open canal with water, where we see that there is a big risk of overflow. In a country where there is a rainy season, when it's raining, you have a risk of overflow, and we see that indeed there are some wastewater residues which are in contact with the soil. So we have a very risky situation where we have a contamination of the soil. So again, environmental audits mean controlling on everything, being able to identify wherever in the factory there might be an environmental risk. I want to highlight something else. I mentioned it a bit earlier, but most of the time, Tier 2 factories are left aside in social compliance audits because most of the companies are doing social audits in Tier 1. But the health and safety of workers, particularly at risk in production sites where hazardous chemicals are heavily used. So if you think about this, for example, you can see in this picture, we have some workers in a denim factory. And it might be a denim laundry. They're doing what we call the PP spray, permanganate potassium spray on the denim product. The permanganate potassium is a very volatile chemical product. The workers exposed to this product might face some health problems. So breathing of contaminated air is the most common workplace health risk to workers. So it means if you're not addressing the air quality in the factory, the workers might face very important health problems. So through the environmental audits, we are addressing air quality and we are addressing the chemical management issues. So addressing these topics is not only beneficial for the environment, is also a way to reduce the worker exposures to chemicals. Okay, now what are the performance areas in an environmental audit? Later, I will discuss about different initiatives and standards. So maybe some of you are aware of the Higg Index, or they heard about ZDHC, or maybe they heard about other environmental audit protocols. More or less, we always have the same chapters. Some will have one or two additional, some will have one or two less. So first of all, of course, we do control that the factory is compliant with laws and regulation. This is one thing. In Eurofins AQM, we decided to address this topic separately from the other chapters of the environmental audits. Why? Because in some countries, the environmental laws and regulation are a very small, let's say, requirement list. And what we wanted to do is to let the customers reading the report being able to see, okay, in compliance with the law, this is the situation in my factory. Apart from the local laws, I can assess the environmental performance of my factory as per the other chapters, water, energy, chemical management. So it's a way to have two different information. One is just the compliance with the law, and then you can, and on the other hand, you can have a look to the environmental performance based on a common standard that is the country. Environmental management system. This is a chapter which is about how the factory is organized to address the topic. Is there a manager in charge of environmental compliance? Is there an environmental policy? Is there an action plan with specific targets and objectives to address environmental issues? This is mainly what is about in environmental management system. Water and energy, these two chapters are very similar. In these chapters, what we are trying to understand is how the factory is monitoring the resources. Do they have appropriate meters to monitor the water? How do they keep the records? Do they have assessment to avoid the waste of water? Do they do the same for energy? Do they try to avoid the waste of energy? This is the first step. Once you're done with this, you can fix some targets and you can implement some actions to try to achieve your targets. But first of all, you need to have a good monitoring system and you need to have proper records of your consumption. Chemical management. So this is one of the most important chapters, in particular in these industries such as leather, textile, toys industry, where hazardous chemicals are being used. That's one of the most critical aspects. So this chemical management chapter is a heavy chapter. The auditor is going to spend quite a lot of time assessing what are the process of the factory when purchasing the chemicals. Do they collect the right data about chemicals? Do they have chemical suppliers transparent about the substances in chemical product? That's very important. Then the factory needs to have a manager who is qualified to work on this topic of chemicals. This person is in charge of the chemical risk assessment. This person must know what are the health and physical risk related to chemicals. This person needs to make sure the chemicals are properly labeled, make sure we have a safety data sheet for the product. This person is in charge to control the production site. The way chemicals are stored and handled is done in a proper way to avoid the risk of incidents, and so on. So this is a very big chapter, and the auditor must have knowledge about chemical management to perform a good environmental audit. Wastewater treatment, this is another big chapter. If your factory has its own effluent treatment plant, they must be auditor a visit of this effluent treatment plant. We are not just going to look at the wastewater test report. That's a document. And in many production countries where we know there might be a certain level of corruption, we know it can be tricky to have reliable documents. So one thing is a document, and for sure it has to be checked, but most importantly, the auditor must observe the effluent and must ask the factory what is the management system around the wastewater. So this is another important part. And the auditor will spend a lot of time observing the effluent treatment plant, different steps, and ask how this effluent treatment plant is operated and controlled. Next chapter is about solid and hazardous waste. So again, it is very important to see the factory is storing temporarily the waste, but most importantly, what we want to see is the factory aware of the final disposal of hazardous waste? What is being done with hazardous waste? That's the main issue. So the auditor needs to investigate about the final disposal of hazardous waste. And that's not always very easy in some developing countries. Then we have a chapter about emissions to air. So in this chapter, what's interesting is that emissions are not only coming from the heavy machines, such as boiler, generator, we are also talking about emissions from chemicals. So that's another important point. And as I mentioned before, the air quality in the factory is a major issue. And so as part of an environmental audit, you need to control as well the air quality in the factory related to the chemicals being used. I will go quickly about this nuisances chapter because it's a little bit less important, because it is mostly about temperature, noise, humidity levels. Then there can be as well a chapter about emergency response. This is very similar to what you see in social audits. So it is again about assessing how the factory is prepared to face an emergency situation. So it's very similar to social audit. Maybe what is new in the environmental audit, but we don't see so much in social audits. Social audit will be focusing mostly on fire emergency, among others, but fire emergency. In the environmental audit, we will insist on the emergency response in case of chemical incident. And this is new. Not many factories are used to be assessed on how do they react in case there is a chemical incident. How is the environmental audit performed? So this is again the same methodology as for social audit. As you know, the auditor is cross-checking evidence based on documents, based on interview, and based on observations. But I want to insist on on-site observations. Why? I definitely think in room check only looking at his checklist, but an auditor observing what is being done in the factory. And so you have two pictures on this slide. On the first picture, that the auditor is visiting the effluent treatment plant. And you might think, oh, that's very technical, that's very complicated. No, the auditor must have learned some criteria for each tank to assess if what he's observing is normal or abnormal. So the auditor is trained to understand very specific points that he needs to check based on observation. You can see as well on the second picture, this guy, this is a worker in a factory manipulating some chemical products. You see that the way he's manipulating the product is very interesting, because the way it is done demonstrates that probably there is no chemical risk assessment that has been done. Otherwise, we won't have this situation. Or maybe the risk assessment has been done, but there is no accurate implementation of the procedures and measures to implement on site to reduce the risk of chemical incident. So observation on site is a very important part of the auditor job. So what I recommend you, when you want to start environmental audits, you need to ask what is the profile of environmental auditor. You need to challenge how was the environmental auditor trained and how the company ensure the quality of the environmental auditor work. What are the most important skills for an environmental auditor? First of all, knowledge in chemical management. So we are not saying that the auditor must be a chemist, but he must have been trained on chemical management good practices in the factory. This is very important. Knowledge in wastewater treatment. Again, I'm not saying that the auditor must be a wastewater engineer, of course not, but he must have been trained about understanding what is an effluent treatment plant, how does it work, what are the typical treatment process, what are the criteria to assess if a process is operated well or not, what are the good practices factories should have implemented for a proper management of the ETP, and so on. So he must have been trained on this. Some knowledge about ISO 40001 is also important. However, I remember when I started the environmental audit service in Bangladesh, I remember some auditors being selected only because they were certified ISO 40001. ISO 40001 is a methodology, is about understanding what should be the framework in an organization to address environmental issues. But it is not telling how the management of chemicals should be done on site, how the wastewater should be addressed in a factory. We are not in the application of controlling environmental aspect with ISO 40001. ISO 40001 is methodology and framework. So it's not enough an auditor only expert in ISO 40001 if he doesn't have experience auditing the factories in specific industries, he will have a lack of knowledge of practical environmental issues. So it's important, but it's complementary to the experience in chemical management and wastewater. Another thing which is very, very important, a good auditor is an auditor taking the time to explain to the factory what are these environmental requirements. I remember attending an audit where the auditor was just doing his job. And so at the end of the day, I could feel that the factory was very uncomfortable because it was the first time they were facing an environmental audit and they were not understanding exactly what was requested. So a good environmental auditor is an environmental auditor taking the time to explain why I'm assessing this environmental aspect, why you should think about changing the way you are doing this. Of course, he's not a consultant, but still some explanation is needed. And this is an important quality, an important skill for an environmental auditor. What does the environmental audit report look like? So, of course, it is again similar to social audit in the way that you have an audit result summary. You have, of course, the audit questionnaire, the factory profile, the corrective action plan, and the photo report. In the audit results summary, what is important is to highlight what are the critical findings, of course. Again, in the same way as the auditor needs to be clear about the environmental requirements when discussing with the factory, in the same way, the audit company must be very clear with the customer about this, because again, it's a new topic, and even for the customer, it's not so easy to understand all the topics. So at least from our side in Eurofins AQM, we try to provide you as much as possible some clarification about the criticity of the findings observed on site. And I think the photo report is also very, very useful because it gives you a very clear idea of what is going on in the factory. And it can also help you if, for example, it's the first time you're auditing this factory, so you have decided to start with environmental audits, but maybe when you're looking at the photo report, you might see, the working environment for workers seem not so safe. So maybe then you can think about conducting a social audit in this factory, because the environmental audit was a way to understand what is going on in the factory. But then, of course, it is up to you to see what is your strategy. Okay, so this was an introduction. Now I would like to give you a short overview of initiatives and standards. And before that, we will have a second pool to know how do you evaluate the relevance of initiatives and standards such as ISO 40001, ZDHC, HIG Index, BP, and other third-party companies' audit protocols. So Fiona, is it possible to have a pool?
It is up already. Can you see it?
I don't, but maybe.
Let me try again.
Yes, okay. So only one question this time, so we are not, it will not take too much time. So what we are asking is, how do you, yes, evaluate the relevance of an initiative? Maybe you don't know any of them. Maybe it is based on what people are saying around you in your network, or maybe you have done a benchmark already, or you just go on the websites, or based on other criteria.
Yeah, and as everyone is voting, so I would just like to remind everyone, if you have questions, please make use of the Q&A box, so it is easier for us to follow up the questions instead of typing your questions in the chat box. Please help us with this. Thank you.
Okay.
Right. I think we can stop the vote. Over half the participants have voted already.
Okay, so we can see the result. Okay, so a majority of attendees voted for the answer based on information available. Okay. Okay, so this is interesting indeed. You have online many information, but I imagine it's not always easy just visiting the websites or watching some seminars or presentations to get an opinion, a clear opinion about the initiatives. So I will continue and accelerate a bit. I'm running out of time. So what is important here is to see the names. One is ISO 40001, which, as I mentioned, is an international standard for the environmental management system. So it's a very good reference, but it's actually focusing on how the factory is organized. And it is quite ambitious. It is a heavy list of requirements for a factory. So it's a good reference, but if the factory has never heard about environmental audit or an environmental management system, it will be very difficult for the factory to get the ISO 40001 certification. At the contrary, for a factory with some experience and already with a very good system with the laws, to be a factory doing much more than just the legal compliance, a factory in this situation can be interested in starting to implement ISO 40001. Other initiatives and protocols. The Higg Index is a famous one. This is a self-assessment tool initially. It means you send a questionnaire to the factory, and the factory by itself is going to fill in the questionnaire. Later on, they decided that it was possible to have verification. And what is important to know about the Higg Index, the members of the initiatives behind Higg Index, they have access to a platform with the self-assessment results. And it's a good way to collect data. This is just an introduction. Roadmap to Zero, initially the name was ZDHC, discharge of hazardous chemicals. This is not an audit protocol, nothing about audit. The ZDHC has published MRSL, Manufacturing Restricted Substances List, and they provide tools and support to help the industry get rid of hazardous chemicals. The Labor Working Group is an audit protocol, and this audit protocol is specifically for the labor industry. It means that there are very specific questions for this type of industrial process. The Labor Working Group is a detailed audit questionnaire. I mean, it's quite dense with a lot of points being covered, and there are only few auditors being accredited by Labor Working Group. So there are some others initiatives such as the BEPI of Amphory and the STEP audit from Ecotex. If you want to learn more about initiatives and standards, we will have a dedicated webinar on April 29th. So please join this webinar if you want to learn more about the initiatives and standards. Okay, last chapter, and then we will have time for questions. Don't worry. So what are the environmental challenges in production countries? Let's start with Bangladesh. So in Bangladesh, you might have seen all these media articles saying that nothing has changed since the Rana Plaza. I want to say that it's not true. I mean, based on my experience visiting and being in this country. In Bangladesh, sorry, I don't know why my slide. Sorry, I have problem with slide. Progress was made in terms of building safety and health and safety, but still air quality is not addressed in this country. What is a good news for Bangladesh is that factories are very open to discussion about audit benefits and environmental awareness, but still there is a lack of expertise and resources. The Bangladesh is a laboratory of the textile industry, and so many projects, pilot projects, were launched in this country. So the factories are used to the environmental topics now. There was a big project about water and energy savings. There was some trainings organized by GIZ about chemical management for the factories. So a lot of projects have been implemented. So there is environmental awareness, but expertise is needed. This is why I definitely think that training, offering training to the factory is very important. As you know, there is a lot of pressure on Bangladesh for social and environmental compliance because there is a high exposure in the media of Bangladesh factories. Regarding the environmental regulations in Bangladesh, the regulations are weak, and the biggest problem that the Department of Environment is struggling to control the factories because there are so many factories in this country. So it's a problem that local authorities are not able to control all factories. China. China, you can see some pictures below, pictures taken in Chinese factories. So in this country, the environmental laws are actually strict, but the problem is the enforcement of the laws. So I must say that in China, many actions were taken to close the factories being not compliant. So sometimes the government, yes, is taking very strict decisions. There is a lack of awareness about the laws and regulation in China, and in particular, there is what we noticed auditing factories in China is a lack of awareness about the chemical hazards. I'm sorry, I have a problem with my slides. Yes, something else I can say about China is that most of the factories done the final goal of audits. So we have a communication difficulty in China. This is a big difference with Bangladesh, for example, where it is much more easier to discuss and to convince factories about the benefit of environmental audits. In China, it is more complex. Okay, Turkey. Quickly about Turkey, what I can say is that in this country, there is a huge gap between very big plant and the very small workshop. So for the big plant, they are compliant with the laws. The workshop, they are struggling. That's a main problem in Turkey. And finally, in India, there are strict laws, but poor enforcement. It's more or less the same as in Bangladesh, even if in India, environmental laws and regulation are more strict and covering more aspects. What is interesting to mention about India is the decision in 2015, the government decided to make ZLD, zero liquid discharge, mandatory for textile units discharging more than a certain amount of wastewater. So this zero liquid discharge means that instead of discharging water, the factory must have a treatment plant with a very advanced treatment system, so the water can be recycled, reused in the factory. So you don't discharge any wastewater. So this decision had important consequences in Tirupur, a region with a lot of textile factories. Many factories had to shut down, but still today we can see that the factories in Tirupur have this zero liquid discharge system. So indeed, we can see that sometimes when the government is taking a decision, it can have a very big impact on the industry. Why did they decide to do this? Because it means the water is becoming a vulnerable resource. It means it becomes more and more difficult to have access to fresh water. This is why some decisions have to be taken. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for my presentation because I definitely want to give time to your questions. So I will let Fiona, yes, just select some of the questions and I will answer.
Yeah, actually, we have quite a lot of questions on hand already, and some of them are really quite long. So I think we'll follow up the longer questions by email, so the answer can be taken easier. And
yes,
we'll first of all take care of some shorter questions. First one is about the wastewater. Will the wastewater be sampled and taken to the lab for independent testing during the auditing?
Okay, this is a very good question, and indeed it is very important and recommended that you ask for sample to be collected and tested independently from what, as I said, from the test report that are shown in the factory. First of all, most of the time in many factories, you might see a wastewater test report which is dated more than 6 months ago. So it's not anymore relevant to rely on this test report. You need to have a much more recent test report to look at. So during environmental audit, is it possible indeed to combine the audit being done on site and to have a wastewater sample to be collected? However, this is not the task of the auditor. The auditor is not the one collecting the water and doing the test. It means there is a laboratory which has been appointed to collect the wastewater sample. Why? Because you need to follow a specific protocol, the wastewater sample. So maybe the auditor is not the person with the knowledge to know how to follow this protocol. So it's better to have an expert from a laboratory making sure that the protocol is applied and this laboratory is collecting the water sample, and then with the environmental audit report, you can get the water test report. I just want to say something. During the environmental audit, the auditor is going to ask the factory to collect a sample and to do the on-site test, because the factory is supposed to have some instruments to do some of the parameters test by themselves. If the factory cannot do any test, this is not a good sign, because to well control the ETP, the factory should have a small laboratory. I'm not saying they must be a full, but they must have some few instruments to test some important parameters. If they don't do so, it's not a very good news.
Okay, so I think we have time for 2 more questions. Sorry everyone that we are overrunning a little bit, but Francesca was trying to give as much information as possible. So don't worry, we'll follow up on unanswered questions by email. Okay, our second last question is about the waste. What is considered as solid waste and what is considered as hazardous waste? What is the difference between these two?
Okay, it's a good question. So indeed, the chapter is often named solid and hazardous waste. Why do we have this formulation? First of all, the idea is to make a distinction between the solid waste and the wastewater, because wastewater can be considered as waste, but this is the liquid waste. So wastewater is a specific solid and hazardous waste. So if we are in the textile industry, we are talking about all the type of waste which we can find in a textile factory. So I can give you example. We have the cartoons, we have textile, the fabric leftovers, we have the empty chemical drums, we have the tube lights, electronic waste, medical waste, and so on. This is a category of solid waste. Among the category of solid waste, you have some waste which is hazardous. I give you examples in the textile factories, but in any other factories using chemicals, we consider that the empty chemical drums are hazardous waste. Another big type of hazardous waste in a factory with wet process is the waste from the effluent treatment plant. So the sludge is the mud that is left after the wastewater is treated. The sludge is produced in very high quantity, and the sludge is a very hazardous waste that the factory has to deal with. This is to give some examples.
Okay, so our last question is about energy consumption. What do you mean by measuring energy consumption in terms of energy consumption? Sorry.
How is done the
energy consumption? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what we check in the factory is, and usually for energy, it is not a big issue, because as you know, factories must pay for energy, or they do produce some energy on site. So usually if it is electricity supplied from the outside system, you must have a meter for electricity. Then what is important to check in the factory is the energy generated on site and the steam. Steam is actually one of the bigger source where you have waste of energy. So this is as well something which is checked during an environmental audit. The auditor is going to observe the steam supply system, and he will observe if there is any steam leak, and he will challenge the factory about measuring the steam consumption, because we all know that in the textile factories, one of the biggest source of waste of energy is coming from steam leak and a problem of steam pipelines.
Okay, great, thank you. So thank you, Francesca, for her presentation. we can go to next slide for your wrap up.
So I will definitely collect your questions and answer by email. So I will take the time to do this, and I promise you will all get the answers to your questions.
Yes.
Okay. So what is the conclusion of this first webinar? First key takeaway. So environmental audit is used to control the risk in countries where laws are poorly enforced, such as Bangladesh, India, or China. Second reason is that through this environmental audit, you can assess very well the factory's capabilities in terms of chemical and wastewater management. And remember that these are the two most critical topics in terms of pollution. The environmental audit is also a way to facilitate a better management of health and safety conditions in tier 2 factories, where, as I said, social audits might not have been conducted. And finally, it is of course also a way to control the risk for your brand image. Regarding initiatives and standards, even if we need to detail this part, I want you today to remember that there is not a single environmental protocol or standard to be considered as a reference. It depends on what you want to do. You have different tools for different purposes. You have tools for self-assessment, you have initiatives focusing you a toolbox to handle the question of hazardous substances. And you have other initiatives maybe focusing more on training than on audit. And this is something which is interesting with environmental audit approaches. We are not only thinking audit, we are thinking, how can I support factories? How can I do this assessment in a different ways? Finally, production countries are still weak in terms of environmental protection. But the good news is that more and more factories are aware of the environmental issues, and I think a lot of them are understanding how important is this topic. So the more from the industry, the people are challenging the factories about this, the more it will become a board agenda to protect the environment. Thank you very much, everyone.
So let's go to the next slide. So I am sorry that the solution is not quite stable today, so there are some hiccups. So here is Francesca's email. If you have anything that you want to clarify, you can email her anytime. And similarly, you will also receive the presentation file as well as the recording tomorrow via email. And we are going to have 3 more webinars this month, and we hope to see you there. And before you go, we hope that you could help us by sparing 2 minutes in completing the survey form that has already been popped up in your Explorer. So until we meet again, so I hope you enjoyed our webinar, and we wish you staying strong and staying healthy and staying safe. Thank you everyone for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.